All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's session of the Association for Mormon Letters virtual conference. We have a great panel together to discuss Mormon literature in the 21st century. So if you have any questions or comments for the panel, please put them in the chat. And hold on just a sec. Oh, shoot. And I can hear myself, so I'm gonna make that go away. I'm gonna turn the time over to our moderator, Natalie Brown, to introduce the panel.
All right, welcome. We are gathered here today on this Friday night to highlight some of the works and trends that are happening in 21st century LDS literature. And I am so excited for this panel because I am primarily a scholar of 19th century literature, and it is such a joy for me to read literature that's being written now when I can understand the context without any research, when I can reach out to the many generous writers that we're going to be hearing about today. So in 2021, we have, of course, the literature that we find in official LDS magazines and publishing outlets like Deseret Book, which tends to be devotional, didactic, inspirational, historical fiction, or what they call proper romance and often Regency romance. Beyond official LDS sources, however, we also have LDS writers working in social media with young adult novels, romance novels, graphic novels, theater, podcasts, film, detective fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. And we have independent publishers and literary journals promoting essays, literature, and poetry explicitly designed for an LDS audience. And moreover, we are gaining more access to the voices of international saints. So these exciting genres, I think, highlight the diversity of LDS voices, as well as some of the difficulties of talking about contemporary LDS literature in a way that's easy to define. So aside from places like Deseret Book and church magazines, there's not really a single or even dominant outlet for literature written by Latter-day Saints, if that's defined broadly. And I think in addition, we have also lacked robust institutions over the past few decades that might have connected LDS writers with each other, and older generations that might have had more print-based or place-based organizations with newer generations that are increasingly online. And as someone pointed out in a previous panel, are often sort of unknowingly retreading a lot of the same ground. So it's been a revelation to me, who got to know LDS literature and figures like Eugene England almost haphazardly when I just happened to connect with people at By Comic and Sen and later on Twitter, just how siloed and non-overlapping some of these communities can be. And even within a genre, LDS authors writing today have very different purposes, audiences, and relationships to the LDS faith. Some write for LDS audiences, others for the general market. Some explicitly depict Mormonism, while others carefully avoid it. We have LDS women on social media making careers out of writing about their domestic lives and finding platforms of authority that have been less available to women in the church. But we also have email lists and blogs and Instagram accounts where other members are engaged in what I think of as canon formation, as they share inspirational quotes from general authorities and might be reinforcing more than questioning this church organization. So I think as in some historical moments it's more possible to identify an overarching literary movement, I think the current profusion of works is more of a testament to the differences in viewpoints and desires amongst LDS writers, and possibly to the lack of church support for LDS literature that might have otherwise been given a stronger impetus in some unifying direction had that institutional support truly been there. So I don't necessarily see contemporary LDS writers engaged in creating a shared vision of 21st century Mormonism as might have been an aspiration in past eras. So despite all this great abundance that we're going to hear about today, there are also, I think, notable absences in this landscape. Mormon characters remain very underrepresented in national presses, although I am very excited that there'll be some books with Mormon characters coming out later this year. And I think that's for reasons that have to do largely with the lack of market for Mormon literature and with some of the ways in which religion is perceived nationally today. And we also have an academic environment where it would be unusual in most places to go through high school or to complete degrees in English literature, having even read a novel by a Mormon. And within wards where things like book clubs might have once supplemented the lack in more educational settings, there's still a great deal of suspicion around texts by or about Mormons that are not officially endorsed. So as we leave this panel, I hope that we will hear about some great examples of the things that we can start reading and sharing. And hearkening back to James' terrific presidential address, I hope we'll leave asking what kind of Mormon literature we'd like to read in the future, and also what ways we can begin better supporting LDS writers and literary institutions and getting these great works that we're about to hear about today out. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists in the order that they will be speaking. So first we'll hear from Andrew Hall, who is an associate professor of East Asian history at Kyushu University in Japan. And he has served on the board of the Association for Mormon Letters and as the literature book review editor for Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Next, we'll hear from Liz Busby, who is a writer of speculative fiction and creative nonfiction. She also writes book reviews and literary criticism, particularly about the intersection between Mormonism and science fiction and fantasy. She graduated from BYU in 2008 with a BA in English and was president of the student branch of AML during her senior year. Next, we'll be hearing from Gabrielle Gonzalez I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this, Nunez, who is an associate professor of translation at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He is the author of 8 children's books, a poetry collection, and a bilingual chapbook, and he has a forthcoming short story collection that will be published by Jade Publishing this year. And he is also a member of the Cofradía de Letras Mormonas, which is a Spanish language Mormon Letters Association that publishes a quarterly literary journal, which in English is called the Deseret Town Crier. Catherine Morris McKill is next, and she received her bachelor's degree in English from BYU, where she founded the student chapter of AML and served on the AML board. She's a former director of the Mormon Artist magazine and a host of the Mormon Artist podcast, and she presents panels at the AML conference and at the LDS Film Festival. She is also a winner of the Segal Poetry Contest and aspiring writer of young adult fantasy. So Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, so I'm sharing a screen, I believe. I will start. So I'm going to give an overview of the history of this decade, kind of the big news that happened. I used to do an annual year in review of Mormon literature. So I look back at my old posts. And so I'm just going to look at the major trends and point out some of the books that I think we should think about for the canon building that we're supposed to be doing this week. So we started the decade with some big losses. Losses or diminutions of 2 dominant voices of the late 20th century Mormon literature. First of all, Eugene England's passing in 2001. Eugene England had been a dominant critical voice of Mormon literature and Mormon studies in the late 20th century. And he was a public intellectual with great stature and moral weight within Mormonism. People knew that he was a believer, that he was a very strong believer, but he also had these strong ideas about the way society could be improved. And he often spoke about Mormon literature. So, and when he spoke, people read his words and talked about his words. And so to have one of the leading voices within Mormon studies frequently talking about Mormon literature and how it could be improved and pointing out the best new books, that really put Mormon literature at the middle of Mormon studies. And after he passed away, we really haven't had that voice. And sometimes I think in Mormon literature, we think we're kind of, junior stepchildren to the history and some of the other fields in Mormon studies. Now, there are some inheritors out there. Terrell Givens is maybe one of the leading public intellectuals these days on Mormon ideas. And he sometimes talks about literature. It's not one of his major themes, but he certainly talks about it. And he's going to have a biography of Eugene England coming out later this year, one of 2 books about Eugene England coming out this year. Michael Austin, who writes at By Common Consent, is also has a certain degree of public stature from his pronouncements, and he talks about Mormon literature, especially 19th century Mormon literature, not quite as much about modern stuff. But so there are two kind of public intellectuals who are somewhat inheritors of Eugene England's mantle. Now, we haven't lost Orson Scott Card, thankfully. He's still doing great, and we were able to honor him with a Lifetime Achievement Award a few years ago at the AML meeting. But I would say in the 21st century, well, so in the late 20th century, from about 1980 to 1999, he really dominated Mormon literature. He was a nationally respected, best-selling author, known throughout the country and the world. And he frequently used Mormon characters, theology, and imagery in his books, and was very interested in using these things. Folk of the Fringe, the Alvin Maker series, the novel Lost Boys, and then the Homemaking series, which is based on the Book of Mormon. These are all, I think, really, really great works, and they really brought in Mormon themes, in a very inventive way, I thought. Unfortunately, I think 1999 is kind of the time where his last great works were published. Things after that, the early 21st century, he had the Women of Genesis series, a desert book with about the wives of the patriarchs, Sarah and Rachel and Leah. I thought those were pretty good, but nothing that could compare to the inventiveness of his 20th century work. And really after 2005, almost nothing at all of importance. He started just repeating himself and doing a lot of co-written work and no significant work. So to have a figure like that who is, again, a best-selling, well-known character who makes Mormonism a central part of his literature go away, I think these were both two huge losses in the critical and kind of in the just having a major author like that be writing. Some trends. Deseret Book became the dominant publisher and bookstore. It started acquiring its competitors, Bookcraft in 1999, Excel Entertainment, the film company in 2004, and Covenant Publishing and Siegel bookstores, which were a package deal, in 2006. So they became almost a monopoly power in Mormon publishing and book selling at that point. And it seemed like, oh my gosh, everything's gonna have to go through Deseret Book to be read. Also, there was a shift, not in the very first years, but by the mid 2000s, away from publishing anything with Mormon themes and towards more historical meaning pre-LDS, so pre-1830 in the United States at least, romances, proper romances, often British-based. Shadow Mountain Publishing, which again, and the proper romance has some great stuff, and Shadow Mountain produces great stuff. It's not stuff that takes on Mormon themes. And I think this is what we're talking about in this conference. This is what we're interested in, is literature that takes on Mormon themes, looks at the Mormon experience. And just Deseret Book becomes uninterested in doing that. And there's a parallel shift in BYU around the same time, away from the study of Mormon literature. Now, the very first years, right after the merger with Bookcraft, actually, they were still doing that. There was this great Margaret Blair Young and Darius Gray series, Staying on the Promises, about the early African-American Latter-day Saints. Dean Hughes' series about Latter-day Saint family during World War II, and then the same family, the next generation in the 60s, really takes on difficult issues of race and gender inequality in LDS culture. Dean Hughes, these are very popular books and very easy to read books in a way, but also very challenging books to LDS culture. And Deseret Book is putting those out. Orson Scott Card's Women of Genesis books, also some challenging things in there. So in the first few years, it seems like, well, okay, Deseret Book was really big, but they're taking on some interesting Mormon themes. But that just kind of starts to go away after about 2004 to 2005. Now, but the only author they have publishing interesting Mormon literature is Dean Hughes, who had this great pair of books about called Muddy and then River in the last 2 years, about the saints in Nevada and Southern Utah and polygamy and the United Order. Really good books. But he's a legacy artist, and I guess they just, they kind of let him, he's a bestseller, and they let him do what he wants. And maybe Gerald Lund has some Mormon themes in his historical novels as well, but that's about it, just these legacy authors. So Deseret Book is not doing Mormon literature for the most part. Well, does that matter? Oh, let me just mention too, as far as romances. And again, I don't want to say anything bad about romances. There can be some great books. There's great work that Mormon authors are doing that are not about Mormon themes, and that's great. Everyone should write about what they feel is they're interested in. But we're trying to talk about Mormon literature here. Carla Kelly is probably the romance author who does the most to bring in Mormon characters, Mormon themes into her romances. She published, I think, most of those for Cedar Fort, not for Deseret. Well, it doesn't matter. Actually, in these years, as Deseret Book is moving away from these themes, is also a time when Mormon literature is largely moving online, and Deseret Book kind of becomes less important, I think. There's a worldwide trend of more online book purchases. So having your book in Deseret Book on the shelves of Deseret Book becomes less and less important. There's a growth in independent and self-publishing. So these are all reducing Deseret Book's kind of stranglehold over, what people are reading in Mormon literature. Also around the same time, there's a decline of the AML as a physical group that meets together, largely BYU, Utah Valley based organization, becomes, and there's kind of a separation. There's the people at BYU and Utah Valley and surrounding areas, Weber State, who are doing the physical conferences, but there's more and more stuff going online, and sometimes there's not much connection between the two groups. And then eventually, basically the online people have now become the leadership of AML. Also around this time, blogs become an interesting place where there's discussions of Mormon literature going on. There's kind of email lists, but then more public blogs. Most importantly, William Morris creates A Motley Vision in 2004 and does lots of very interesting critical work there. And it's a great place where lots of people are gathering and talking. And Derek Jepson and Scott Hales and Kent Larson and lots of other people are writing there as well. And it becomes a really vibrant place for over a decade. Also, this is a time when LDS independent publishers are doing really interesting work. Zare Hemlip books in the first decade, especially, and just the last 4 years or so, BCC Press becomes very vibrant and using the power of the BCC blog and social media to get their books more known in the Mormon reading public. Mormon Lit Blitz, James and Nicole Goldberg start this more than annual. I think maybe a couple times a year where they have these contests. Very short, easy to read, easily digestible. One's going on right now. In fact, the most recent one is happening now. So make sure you're reading those opportunities to get very bite-sized, simple introductions to Mormon literature. And Iriantum, which is the literary journal of the Association of Mormon Letters and was a paper journal until 2013, but then went out of business with all the problems that all magazines, all printed journals are having. Comes back as an online journal with William and Therick leading that in 2018. Now, and also during this period, LDStorymakers, which is now just called Storymakers, forms as an authors guild and an opportunity to get together and have annual conferences and encourage each other and teach each other, have education amongst LDS authors in Utah. So that's a very important movement in getting authors talking about also, a lot of the bad contracts that were going on in Mormon literature and how to improve that was an important role they played. They started Whitney Awards in 2007 and lots of different genres, recognizing all different kinds of things. It's been wonderful. Here I just have a list of the best adult novel of the year each year. Some wonderful books. Just pointing out here, the ones in green are the only ones that have Mormon characters, Mormon themes. Maybe a little bit, I think this Tracy Hunter Abramson has, the characters are Mormon, but I don't think Mormonism comes in too much into those. So just, the kind of books that they're recognizing certainly do not have to be focused on Mormonism and usually are not. But great books, great organization. AML novels awards, on the other hand, are usually focused on Mormon literature, not always, but there's much more often have Mormon themes, Mormon characters, Mormonism as a big part of it. There's some ones in the last 2 decades. So looking at these books that are especially about Mormonism and bringing in some other books that weren't the AML Novel Award winners, I kind of made a list of ones that I think are the most important for these decades. The ones I think should be considered for the canon. And for the first decade, the ones I remember, the decade ago, it's been a long time since I read them, but the ones I really, really remember very strongly, I have here and read, but I think some of the other ones too. Some of the other ones I just haven't read, but I just know from reputation that they're great books. The list is pretty much dominated by, some historical fiction, but a lot of contemporary realism with Benyon and Thayer, Peterson, continuing this tradition from the late 20th century. But a little bit of turn to the modern forms and some fantasy magic elements with Karamassinus's The Pictograph Murders and Stephen L. Peck's work. Then the most recent decade, these ones I love them all so much, and I've read them so recently that I feel strongly about all of them. There's more of this turn towards postmodern forms. Tim Werkus, he has two novels, The City of Breck and Shadow and The Infinite Future, which are both amazing books and that really break away from the modernist, realist paradigm. Stephen L. Peck who we're honoring tomorrow, does amazing work that breaks from these forms. DJ Butler in fantasy brings in Mormon elements in a way that I think really blew a lot of us away. And so he becomes really very important to a lot of us. Okay. Short fiction collections. The first decade, there wasn't too many. Todd Robert Peterson's Long After Dark is a great collection. Jack Harrell's A Sense of Order and Other Stories, which has a little bit of the fantastic in it. But those, actually quite a bit of the fantastic in it. Peterson is more of the modernist realist kind. A few anthologies get done. Angela Hallstrom's Dispensation Latter-day Fiction is the next major anthology of Mormon fiction for the last 15 years before that time. William Morris and Derek Jepson do their first anthology of horror and speculative fiction, Monsters and Mormons. And the William Morris's and Stephen Peck's two collections of both with a lot of fantasy elements in it are very close to my heart. So all these are quite good. Levi Peterson, just this last month, I believe, this month, Signature has a new collection of his short stories as well. Young adult, middle grade novelists, so many, just from the late 90s and certainly in the 2000s, just an explosion of authors. You can't keep up with all of them, mostly not on Mormon themes. Some of my favorites who have published lots of novels with just strong, solid work throughout. Julie Berry and Shannon Hale are probably my two favorites. But all this Ali, Martine, Chris, and DLS, Jeff Zentner, all just do amazing work. Some really big bestseller authors who become very nationally known: James Dashner, Brandon Mull, Ali Condi, Becca Fitzgerald. Ones that have actual Mormon characters in Mormon situations, I list here on the bottom. I'm especially fond of, well, I especially know Louise Plummer's Dance for Three about adoption, and Kristen Randall's Slumming about some Mormon teenagers decided they need to, help the poor benighted people around them and getting into some trouble based on that. Really excellent novels. And I haven't read the Kimberly Houston ones, but I've heard good things about those. So now I'm just going to throw out just a couple things here. I know I'm out of time. Comics, LDS Comics becomes a very interesting place where people are taking on interesting Mormon themes through comics. And I'm really looking forward to Noah Van Scriver, who talked about his own childhood, his Mormon childhood, in One Dirty Tree, has a comic about Joseph Smith coming out soon, which I'm really looking forward to. Matt Page's Future Day Saints is a great fantasy that just came out this year. Mormon theater, we really should have someone talking about that just a full time in this panel. I don't think we do. Eric Samuelson, Mahanri Stewart, Melissa Leilani Larson are just all doing, amazing work and real entrepreneurs. With theater, it's not just writing a book and putting it out there. You've got to put it on. You got to put on a play. You got to get a place. You got to get the people, the audience there. And all these artists are I think, are an inspiration to us for not only the work they produce, but also their entrepreneurial spirit in, creating theater companies and getting people to come to their plays. Also, this last couple decades, we've finally just the last couple of years going beyond the white American experience. Gabriel's going to talk about Spanish literature in a minute. In 2010, Scott Hale said in a review of Hallstrom's anthology Dispensation that it foreshadowed the possibility of Mormon fiction more aware of the church's transnational experiences. Because it had stories by white Americans, but about the international church. And it kind of foreshadows Hale's and Hallstrom's own work on Saints, where they're editors of that series, and they're both worked on trying to bring in more of an international perspective. But finally, just in the last couple of years, we actually are having people beyond white American and straight authors, some LGBT subjects being talked about, authors. James Goldberg and Mel Larson are both authors of color, and they're become leaders in the field. The Mormon Blitz, Lit Blitz, has an around the world contest where they're bringing in, and translating literature by Mormons from around the world, a Spanish language contest. And just this year, the finalists in the various awards, we have more international and more racial diversity than we've ever seen. Gabriel writing a book in Spanish. The first time I think we've had a non-English language book be a finalist. Shamile's is a finalist in both middle grade and young adult. Shamile Mendez, and she's a Argentine-American with Arabic descent. And our first two African-American or African finalists, Fatima in religious nonfiction, and Sofer Kabambi, the director and writer of Hearts of Africa, with Margaret Blair Young, the film finalist. There's a few other little things that have happened the last couple decades of great interest. Of course, Stephanie Meyer in Twilight, God's Army, book more musical, Educated, big bestseller. A Mormon publisher became known as a murderer. So some interesting history things. Okay, I'm sorry I went long, and I will stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew. Now we're going to move to Liz.
Okay, I made slides too. Let's get this going. Had to go with the alliteration. So I am here to talk about Mormons and sci-fi and fantasy, because that's what I read the most of. And I pulled this quote from Mormon Artist, which was mentioned in the chat, and Catherine's going to talk to us later. But in a 2009 article published in the Boston Globe, Carol Lynch Williams explains how book publishers these days have a tendency to look at the proliferation of authors in Utah and wonder what the heck is in the water here. There are just so many prominent Mormon authors in science fiction and fantasy, and people are wondering why, what's going on here. So my thesis here is there's kind of a few things. And first of all, it's been talked about a lot in the past of the religious power of science fiction and fantasy. The granddaddies of the modern fantasy genre are C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, both very religious writers. This is a long tradition in fantasy to use fantasy to talk about religious themes. And a lot of science fiction and fantasy themes overlap with themes that Mormon authors want to write about. Deification, good versus evil, interaction with the supernatural and the potential of mankind, even aliens. God's children on other worlds is a pretty prominent theme in Mormon science fiction. But I'm going to kind of set that aside because there are a lot of great articles talking about that, and you can look up more about that. But I wanted to talk mostly about these last two. There are a lot of institutions that are supporting rising authors in Utah of science fiction and fantasy, and in the Mormon community more generally, not just Utah. And then the influence of these successful national figures. So unlike Mormon literature in general, which kind of had a lot of its institutions fall apart at the beginning of the 21st century, the institutions for science fiction and fantasy for Mormon authors are just growing. The BYU science fiction and fantasy writing class is very practical. It focuses on how to make a living as a science fiction and fantasy author. It's at least half and half. That was taught by David Farland, and then Brandon Sanderson took it over in the second decade. And we see lots of prominent authors coming out of that class and making it a career. It teaches them that you can do this as a career. It's not just a dream. And then, yeah, we have the Writing Excuses podcast by Brandon Sanderson, Dan Wells, Howard Taylor. They started that in, I believe, 2008. So it's on season 16 and has been bringing in more authors. But the first 10 years or so were just 3 Mormon white guys talking about science fiction and fantasy literature. And a lot of the authors in Utah have listened to it and learn a lot from them. So I feel like they've had a big influence on the Mormon science fiction and fantasy community through that. There are several writing conferences in Utah focused on that. Life, the Universe, and Everything conference was started back in 1980, but became independent from BYU in 2012 and has just grown hugely and become a much more focused on craft and helping people to build their careers as science fiction fantasy authors. We also have there's tracks for science fiction and fantasy at Storymakers and at Writing and Illustrating for Young Readers, which are both career focused, getting people to start publishing and be consistent and have a career. And then there are several outlets for LDS short stories and publishers. We have The Leading Edge, which has been around again since the 1980s, but we also had Scott Card's Intergalactic Medicine Show, which was from 2005 to 2019. And then Deep Magic was a magazine that was in Utah for clean science fiction and fantasy. It just announced that it's closing, but it went for 5 years and lots of Mormon authors published there. And Shadow Mountain has published a lot of children's and YA science fiction and fantasy in the past few years. As Andrew talked about, they've moved away from Mormon themes, but they've kind of jumped on the Harry Potter bandwagon. It felt like as soon as Harry Potter got popular, they said, oh, we can publish lots of clean fiction, science fiction and fantasy for kids, and that sells really well. And I see this continuing. Brandon Sanderson announced in December that he's starting his own audiobook imprint called Mainframe. And my guess is this is going to be a big platform for a lot of Mormon authors. I know he's starting several co-writing projects with other Mormon authors in the state. So his influence is going to grow even further with that. Speaking of influence, like Andrew pointed out, we have had a lot of nationally recognized authors in science fiction and fantasy. We have Shannon Hale, who won the Newbery Award. We have Twilight, which was a national phenomenon. We have Brandon Sanderson, who was chosen to complete the Wheel of Time and just catapulted to the top of the epic fantasy genre. The Maze Runner, again, feature-length film. And we had the Ender's Game film, and just so many other authors being published nationally. We had lots of winners of the Writers of the Future contest who are members of the church. Orson Scott Card and David Farland and Brandon Sanderson are judges of that contest. We see a lot of Mormon authors coming through there. So I think that a lot of the up and coming authors see all of this success from authors who they know are Mormon, who are LDS, who talk about their faith, and they say, hey, I could do that. I could do that too. We have also had a lot of notable speculative fiction about Mormons. Like Andrew mentioned, we have the stories by Stephen Peck. He has really interesting stuff going on. We have William Morris's work on the Monsters and Mormons and States of Deseret. I know there's several in the Lit Blitz that are really interesting. DJ Butler has been doing really interesting stuff recently with, it kind of feels like Scott Card's Alvin Maker series with the Witchy Eye series, kind of an alternate history, magical America, but it has Mormon themes in it. And then The Cunning Man, which is set in Utah. The main character practices the folk magic that is based on seer stones and divining rods and familiar spirits, all these kind of very Mormon types of magic. And then I haven't read any of these yet, but the covers and the titles just kill me. The Mormon Steampunk Anthology series, which he's helped create, all made of hinges. I mean, is that the best title for a steampunk collection ever? I just couldn't stand it. It's great. So I feel like there's a lot going on in Mormon science fiction and fantasy, and that it's only going to continue to grow because we have strong institutions there that just keep perpetuating more strong institutions, and it's really growing and growing. And I feel like it's a really great area of Mormon lit right now.
Thank you so much, Liz. And now we're going to turn the time over to Gabrielle.
Thank you. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the lay of the land in the Spanish-speaking world. Of course, there are Latter-day Saints there who live out their lives in Spanish, and we all have this urge to create in all languages and cultures. So to really go to understand what's going on right now, we do need a brief historical recap. So let me just turn back to the 20th century briefly. In the first half of the 20th century, the outlet that Latter-day Saints who wanted to write about Mormon themes had was the church magazines, plural, because there were different ones and different missions and things. And it was mostly poetry, but occasionally short fiction, what you found there. And it was mostly overtly religious, didactic, inspirational. But you also found some things in there that really were completely unrelated to the Mormon experience. It was just a place where Latter-day Saint authors could publish. Now, in the mid-20th century, we see sort of this correlation movement and control of the church magazines come under church headquarters. And gradually, it doesn't happen overnight, but gradually you start seeing less and less of this poetry and literature in the Liahona, which is by now the single Spanish magazine. But you do see some things in the local pages that will be published by the local people. However, by the late 80s, this has disappeared altogether. It's trickled into nothingness. And so that outlet disappears. And the question then is what happened at that point to Latter-day Saints who wanted to publish? Did they stop writing? And of course, you know, the answer is no. That's why I'm here. They simply moved elsewhere. And that's sort of where we are right now. They moved into really less visible places. And in a sense, it became sort of a more isolated thing because there wasn't a central hub where these things could come into. So let me show you, I have a few quick slides that I'd like to share with you. So let me share my screen to point out a few of these things. So first of all, there are Latter-day Saints who are publishing in the general market. So Citlali Xochitiotzin, I'm sure I said that wrong, is a poet. She's also published a biography of her father, who's a famous muralist in Mexico. I have some books for children about historical figures in Uruguay. Carlos Garcia Egures, who is also an Uruguayan, has some stories for children also that are inclusive. So this is the general market, but it's decidedly, like if you're LDS and want to publish in the general market, this has to be decidedly non-Mormon stuff. So where is the more sort of Mormonish things? Where do we find them? Well, we find them in blogs. There are still a number of literary blogs out there. I'm just putting two examples here, but these aren't the only ones. So Ana Enriquez in Argentina, Santiago Vázquez also in Argentina, they have these blogs where they write, you know, they have their literary work on there, mostly short pieces. Another place, of course, where a lot of this has gone is social media. So again, only two examples. You have Luis Jorge Verano, who's an Argentine poet, Miki Calzada, who is a Mexican poet, and they self-published their books. And then later they come onto social media to try to sort of promote their stuff. And so they put their poems up there and you can go and read them as well. So what I'm hinting at is that sort of a big outlet right now, the big outlet probably is self-publishing. Maybe the biggest one, and we don't have time. This is just a sampling of it. It's not all the books that have been published in the 21st century. And we don't have time to go over what each one of these is, but you get sort of a wide range from the stuff that is not really Mormon themed at all, to things that have some of it, to things that are like squarely in your face Mormon things, like this, El Estandarte de la Libertad, that's a play, and it's, you know, about the Jaredites, but sorry, the Standard of Liberty, Estampas del Libro Mormón, that I wrote is, I mean, you can see on there, it's very much a Mormon book as El Aguijón or Mormones Cuarentones. You get literature for children, you get short stories, you get you know, poetry, lots of poetry. And so self-publishing is the big route to go. There isn't really in the Spanish-speaking world, because Latter-day Saints in the Spanish-speaking world are spread out so thinly. There's no Mormon corridor, that there's no critical mass sort of to justify a press that would be publishing Mormon literature. Also, distribution would be very difficult because it'd have to be international and other things. So self-publishing is a where you find a lot of, or probably most of these things. And when I say publishing, when I say self-publishing, I'm also thinking of vanity presses as well as a form of self-publishing. There is a publishing house though, Ulterior Editorial, run by Rafael Vázquez. Now he said to me, this is not a Mormon publishing house. I don't want it to be, it will not be. But every author he's published so far is LDS. Now, so there's 3 examples on here. Noria is a novel, San Rafael is a novel, Eleusis is a novel. Noria and Eleusis are Mormon books, if you will. San Rafael is not, but he assures me that the next novel will be gritty and dark and will not be written by Mormon. So not a Mormon publisher. Now, how do I know this? Because I'm part of the Cofradía de Letras Mormonas, which we put together along with Mario Montani. He's the guy with the goatee and the white shirt, and Rafael Vázquez, goatee and black shirt, and also Patricio Masilla, goatee and no shirt. Well, he has a coat on. And then we also have Indira de Viage, who is our one of our designers, and that's me. That's my best picture on there. And we decided to put this association together to go and seek out the stuff that's been written, because we were all interested in literature but had no clue what was out there. So we decided to go and look at old things and new things, and also to promote it. So we created El Pregonero de Seret, or Desert Town Crier, to have an outlet, because the outlets had disappeared for decades, where people who wrote exclusively Mormon stuff could come. So I know I'm basically out of time, but I do want to mention one novel, which is Eleusis. If you read Spanish, you should read this novel. It's the first, as far as I can tell, strictly Mormon novel that was written in Spanish. It's a multi-generational story. It jumps back between time periods of a family in Mexico. It's high caliber, it's not amateurish. It's intellectual yet accessible, and as you can probably guess from the cover, it's also a challenging novel. And I should say, Rafael didn't like that cover. He later had a different one, as you can see up here. But anyway, because it puts this juxtaposition, that it looks at the beginnings of the church in central Mexico as a sort of heroic, very beautiful period for Latter-day Saints, and at the church currently in Mexico as sort of how should I say this? It's very critical of the Mormons in Mexico at this point. But it's definitely worth a read if you can read in Spanish. And I think with that, I'll let someone else come along.
And Gabriel just mentioned there's a translation of the first 2 chapters in Dialogue, this latest issue of Dialogue of that novel that James did.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading that. I've been so struck by how all of these presentations thus far have really highlighted the importance of institutions and outlets to the story of what's being produced or not in LDS literature right now. So thank you all. We are now going to hear from Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine McKell. I worked on Mormon Artist. Ben Crowder and I started it when we were undergrads at BYU in Provo. We were both involved in the Association for Mormon Letters student chapter, and then also James Goldberg started the New Play Project, and we were involved with that. And so then Ben and I started the magazine Mormon Artist, and really it was just because we were curious to find out who was out there creating Mormon art. And so we didn't restrict it just to literature, but we interviewed artists from every kind of art that you could think of, music and sculpture and dance and anything you could think of. But for the first few years, I was in charge of the literature interviews because of my background in the Association for Mormon Letters. And then eventually I ended up hosting a podcast, which ran for I think 1 year, but I ended up interviewing about 16 or 17 authors. Listening to all of these presentations makes me want to bring the magazine back. It's been on hiatus for a while because Ben got married and I started grad school, and then I got married and Ben started grad school. So, yeah, when we started, a lot of people said, Mormon artists, are there any Mormon artists? And we found out there are a lot of Mormon artists. This was before even, it was before or maybe right around the same time that the New York Mormon Artists Group started. And so they also were doing something similar in bringing to light all of these different artists in all of these different genres. But we were focused on the artists themselves, and we didn't really distinguish between genres. So if someone was writing literary fiction, great, we wanted to interview them. If they were writing mass market fiction, that was great too. We assumed that if they agreed to an interview with us, then they probably identified as a member of the church and fit with our audience, who we considered to be just kind of mainstream active Latter-day Saints. And a few things, I wasn't really going to talk about this, but those other interviews kind of, or those other presentations kind of inspired me. I want to focus on the words of the interviewees themselves and just kind of add to what's been discussed at this conference by going right to the writers' voices of why they write, what inspires them, and that intersection between the gospel and their creativity. But one thing I did want to say is that a lot of has been talked about regarding audience at this conference, and it's an ongoing discussion in Mormon literature and in other Mormon art venues. And what I would say is that one of the things that we found was that there's definitely an audience, and I think that one way to find that audience is definitely to combine genres and also to really highlight works that are not too hostile to mainstream Latter-day Saints, which is what we tried to do. So we tried to avoid, if someone was writing something that was very critical or hostile or could be perceived that way, then we tended to not interview them, and usually they were probably not that interested in being interviewed by us anyway. Which isn't to say that those works aren't worth looking at. It's just that I think if you are trying to grow an audience for Mormon literature, it's going to be so small anyway. It's that you need to keep in mind that if you recommend a book, you want to be able to give it to someone, a young woman in your ward, or to your grandma. I remember I was talking to one LDS writer, who I won't name, who submitted a short story, no, it was an essay, to a publication, one of the Mormon journals, which I also won't name. Great author, great publication, a lot of really good stuff in that publication. But I remember he said, my essay, and this essay was kind of in praise of certain aspects of Mormonism. It was literally right next to an essay that was encouraging people to not follow a particular precept of the gospel. And he's like, I can't give this to my grandmother to read. How can she read my essay when it's, it's right next to this other essay? And so I think sometimes the concern about audience is, when we say there's no audience for Mormon literature, sometimes we have to look at how we're presenting Mormon literature and what things that we share. And I think that's a really great thing to have lists that people can look at so they can see what is available. And Anyway, that was just a kind of a thought I had about other presentations. But I wanted to just for a couple minutes, I know we're short on time, get into some of the, 5 minutes. Get into, let me just read a couple of quotes from some of the authors who we interviewed. And like I said, we interviewed literary authors, we interviewed authors writing for the LDS market, so Gerald Lund, Jack Wayland, we interviewed Stephen Peck, we interviewed Shannon Hale and Brandon Sanderson or Orson Scott Card. And let's see, so there are some common themes when we asked people about how the gospel influences their writing or what they felt their writing was contributing to Mormon culture or to building the kingdom. There are a lot of different responses. So some of them were, most of them were the gospel just kind of influences me as a person. And so that, and in turn, that influences my writing. I really liked this response by Annette Lyon, and she wasn't able to join us last night, so I'm going to read hers. We asked, how do you see your work helping to build the kingdom? She said, in some ways, I think fiction helps us move closer to being like our heavenly parents. Van Gessel, former Dean of Humanities at BYU, gave a powerful devotional where he defended reading fiction, saying in part, can we, I wonder, ever be gods and goddesses of our own universes, eternal parents of imperfect beings, who will have to go through the mortal travails as each of us will have done without somehow having an understanding of and even an empathy toward our flawed progeny. And went on to say that fiction is one powerful way to learn how to gain that understanding. I hope my writing provides a window into another perspective. Jack Wayland, so we asked him, how does the gospel influence your writing? He said, first of all, having the knowledge that every person is important and worth consideration. And second, that the Savior can help us with whatever our problems are. Steve Peck, he said, it's fun to reimagine our culture from a different perspective. So he was asked about writing speculative fiction, which goes along with the science fiction and fantasy presentation. I think speculative fiction offers a chance to explore things that are deeply held in ways that are safer than a straight up treatment. I read the New York Times article about how Mormons dominate in genre fiction because it's safer or something. But for me, I like science fiction fantasy just because growing up, I was encouraged to speculate wildly about the heavens and the earth. Mormonism lends itself well to a rich imagination. I'm a product of that background and world. Larry Correa, his was kind of simple. We asked him, how's the gospel influenced your writing? He says, I don't write sex scenes. And then he goes on to explain what he does instead. Dan Wells talks about how in his John Cleaver books, he says he didn't set out to write something gospel related. He said, so he wrote a book about a teenage sociopath fighting a demon. He says, but it ended up being a perfect allegory of the natural man is an enemy to God and our struggle to fight against our baser natures. Not because I wrote it that way on purpose, but because my beliefs crept in there subconsciously. And then I just want to end with Susan Howe. She's a poet. How do you see poetry building the kingdom? And she says, we learn by imagining what we have not personally experienced. So she said, we learn by experiencing things and then also by imagining. How do we learn what Christ is like and what it must be to talk with him? We imagine ourselves doing it, and that active attention makes it possible for the Spirit to enter our hearts and let us feel Christ's love. Or how do we forgive someone who has wounded us and isn't the least bit sorry, the most difficult individual to forgive, but not excluded from Christ's injunction, unless we are able to imagine the world from the perspective of that offender, to feel the lack and need and fear that caused him or her to strike out. Imagination, as I have experienced it, can be part of and lead to spiritual growth, and imagination is the natural province of the poet. A poet's range is something of a gift, and a poet has to work within that range, but each poet can express something of the complexity and depth and eternal value of human experience. So as you can see, these authors, they all come from different backgrounds and different genres, but they're really thinking about their faith and creativity in complex ways. Anyway, that was all I wanted to say. So.
Well, thank you all. This has been absolutely wonderful. I have learned about so many authors and institutions out there that I didn't know before. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, so we're not going to have time for a lively conversation on the Zoom. But I really hope that we can continue this conversation online and outside of this conference, and think about what we can do to strengthen these institutions and about what kind of future we want to see for LDS writers and Mormon literature. So thank you all. So this was fantastic.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks very much, everybody. This has been really, really great. And thanks to everyone who's participating on our YouTube Live. We're going to end this meeting now, and please stick around for the award readings that are being happening in just a couple of minutes. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good night.
I'm sorry I went so long.
I thought this was great. You guys were so good. It was so interesting. I love from